Welcome to Bedcrime Stories podcast. I'm your host, T. Hi, friends. I hope you're having a great day. Thank you so much for listening and for your generous support. They say money is the root of all evil, and this bedcrime story will show that's true. We have to travel back to 1920s America. You're in the open prairies of Oklahoma. This is where the Osage Native American nation finally ended up after being forced off their land in the Midwest. They were given this land because it was rocky and infertile. It was a place where the white man wouldn't be able to farm. So the Osage actually bought this land in Oklahoma, which was about the size of Delaware, and they settled there. At this point, there are only about a few thousand Osage left, and many of them are starving, and life is truly brutal. Well, lo and behold, the land that the Osage purchased, the land that the white man didn't want, turns out to be sitting on some of the largest oil deposits in the United States. Overnight, the Osage people become the richest people per capita in the country. How it works is that each of the Osage families that own a plot of land has what's called a head right. This is basically a share in the oil trust that gets established. Anyone with a head right receives a check every 4 months for any royalties or any leases derived from the oil. At first, they were getting maybe $100 per check. Then it grew to $1,000. And after that, it just kept growing. By the 1920s, the Osage had accumulated millions and millions of dollars. Now, for the Osage, someone in the U.S. government decided that they needed to have guardians, white male guardians, watching over them and their expenditures. The white man didn't feel they were competent enough to do it on their own. Shame on the white man. So they end up being forced to deal with guardians. You guessed it, white male guardians. Shame on the white man, once again. And if you're a full-blooded Osage, the system deems you, quote unquote, incompetent. Despite the guardian, the Osage are able to build themselves mansions and furnish them with the finest stuff. They have servants. They purchase jewelry, fur coats, cars, cattle. They have chauffeurs. Whatever it is, they have it. Well, their wealth doesn't go unnoticed by the local whites, some of whom are soon very sick with envy. So what do you think the whites do? Wanting to get their hands on the money, some of those white men befriend the Osage. And in many cases, local white men start marrying rich Osage women. Well, it's not long after that that the Osage become associated with another statistic, a more dark and sinister one. Along with being the richest people per capita, they also become the most murdered people per capita. Some of them are being poisoned, others are being shot. It soon becomes apparent that these are not accidents. Someone or someones are doing in the Osage people in order to steal their wealth, laying claim to their percentage of the oil riches. The problem is no one seems to know who's behind the crimes. In fact, it becomes one of the first mysteries that J. Edgar Hoover's Bureau of Investigation takes on. Now, one of the Osage who married a white man was a beautiful woman named Molly. Molly was born in the 1880s, and she grew up in an Osage lodge, practicing the Osage traditions and speaking Osage. About 30 years after her birth, the oil deposits are found, and Molly soon finds herself living in a mansion. A white man named Ernest Burkhart takes a fancy to Molly, and he ends up marrying her. Suddenly, Ernest is living in Molly's and her mother, Lizzie Q's mansion, and he's enjoying the good life thanks to her bank account. It just so happens that Lizzie Q has two full head rights, her own and the one she inherited from her first husband, who has died. Molly and Ernest go on to have a couple of kids, and life is good, at least for a while. But in the early morning hours of May 22nd, 1921, something strange happens. Molly's 34-year-old sister, Anna Brown, goes missing. Anna and Molly's other sister, Minnie, had died 3 years earlier in what doctors called a peculiar wasting illness. Minnie was just 27 when she passed away and had been in excellent health before the onset of this disease. Now, Anna is known to throw down the whiskey, if you know what I mean. It's not unusual for her to go out drinking, dancing, and carousing with friends until the sun rises. And according to Anna's servant, she has very loose morals with white men. So Molly, when Anna goes missing, likely thinks maybe Anna tied one on and then fell down somewhere. Molly goes out looking for Anna all along the prairie, but Anna's nowhere to be seen. A week later, Anna's body is found in a ravine. Upon closer inspection, it's obvious she didn't fall down. Someone shot her in the back of the head. Now, one of the last people who interacted with Anna was Ernest Burkhart's brother, Brian. So questions start arising about Brian Burkhart. But in the beginning, there's no evidence, there's no witnesses connecting him to the crime, other than the fact that he dropped Anna off at her house earlier on the evening she went missing. Lizzie Q, her mother, inherits Anna's head right. So now she has Minnie's, Anna's, her deceased husband's, and her own. So Lizzie Q is getting 4 checks every 4 months. And then, not long after Anna dies, Molly's mother, Lizzie Q, becomes mysteriously sick. Her body begins to wither away. No one seems to know what's happening to her. Within 2 months, Lizzie's dead. Evidence will later show that she'd been poisoned. So within a 2-month period, Molly lost her sister and her mother, one to murder, and one who is believed to have died from this mysterious wasting disease. Molly doesn't yet know that her mother was poisoned, and the deaths keep coming. Not long after Lizzie Q's death, Molly experiences another trauma. One night around 3 a.m., she awakes to a loud explosion. She goes to the window and looks down the street, and she sees a massive fire down at her sister's house. Someone had planted a bomb under the house. Molly's sister, Rita Smith, Rita's husband, Bill, and Nettie Brookshire, their servant, die in the incident. Molly is obviously absolutely horrified. She's lost everyone in her family now. And there's an obvious pattern. Someone targeted her family, and she's thinking that she's probably going to be next. With her 3 sisters dead, her father dead, her mother dead, and her brother-in-law dead, Molly inherits all their head rights. It's an absolute fortune. Ernest, by virtue of being married to Molly, gets to enjoy those riches. And now Molly, who's diabetic, by the way, and needs insulin to survive, well, she starts suffering from poor health, and it appears she's dying. She seems to have that wasting away disease. Her husband, Ernest, administers the insulin for her. Other Osage people are also dying mysteriously. Many of them are being shot. But the local sheriff is white, and he's not trained in being a detective. He also doesn't seem all that motivated to solve the crimes. Molly, determined to get justice and answers, issues rewards for information, and she turns to private investigators. One white man who is trusted is an oil guy named Barney McBride. Molly and the other Osage ask McBride to go to Washington, D.C. to plead for help. McBride agrees. He goes to D.C., and guess what happens? He ends up getting abducted and then stabbed to death. And this continues to happen to anyone who dares to try to help the Osage get answers to these crimes. The Osage begin hanging lights around their houses so that they're illuminated at night. They also lock their doors. Some Osage even move to California to get away. The horror of all this is so bad that it's destroying the Osage Nation. This is when the Bureau of Investigation gets involved. The Bureau would later be renamed the FBI. A former Texas Ranger named Tom White is chosen to lead the investigation into the Osage murders. White assembles a crew of undercover frontier lawmen to help him infiltrate Osage County to try and find out what's going on. They begin to discover an enormous criminal enterprise designed to swindle the Osage out of their money. Some of the local white men are stealing and skimming money from the Osage, and they're living by a code of silence. No one is willing to rat out anyone. After the investigation, it becomes clear that some white men who married Osage women were betraying their wives for the money. The people committing the crimes were people who the victims trusted and that they even loved. And Molly Burkhart eventually finds out that a person she knew and a person she loved and trusted was a part of the conspiracy and the group of people who targeted her mother and her two sisters and her brother-in-law. She finds out in the nick of time, too, because if this went on any longer, she would have died. You see, Ernest was a key part of the conspiracy. He was slowly poisoning her through her insulin injections. Molly is absolutely devastated to learn this. She was harboring one of the men who killed her family members, and it's her husband. Warrants for the arrests of Ernest and his uncle for the deaths of Rita and Bill Smith and their servant were issued on January 4th, 1926. Ernest ends up ratting out his uncle. He refuses, though, to implicate his brother Brian for Anna's death. He identifies a different man as being the killer, a guy named Kelsey Morrison. Morrison then confesses to his role. He says that he and Brian got Anna drunk and then drove her to the ravine, and he's the person who shot Anna, not Brian. But Brian was clearly involved in the scheme. Ernest ended up pleading guilty, and he received a life sentence for the murders of Rita Smith, Rita's husband, Bill, and their servant. Ernest then testified against his brother and his uncle, who was the mastermind of the conspiracy against Molly's family. The uncle, he was the guy who really put this whole scheme together. Ernest and his uncle are sentenced to life in prison, but they later receive a parole despite protests from the Osage. Brian Burkhart gets acquitted in his trial for Anna's murder. He later gets immunity for also testifying against the others were involved in the conspiracy. It sounds like no one was charged in connection with Minnie and Lizzie Q's deaths. In the end, hundreds of millions of dollars were swindled from the Osage, and at least 60 members of the nation, and probably a lot more, were killed for their head rights. It came out that the whites in Osage really viewed the Osage people as sort of subhuman. Perhaps this is what made it so easy for them to take all of these people's lives. They didn't view them as human beings. The Great Depression then came soon after these murders, and more Osage money was lost. Gradually, the oil in the land was depleted, and while some Osage today still receive royalties from the oil, it's nothing compared to the vast fortunes that their predecessors once enjoyed. This story is so much more than just this small slice that I've shared with you. If you want to see the story come alive, go see Killers of the Flower Moon, which is in theaters right now. Until the next time on Bed Crime Stories.